Ahora me voy a poner un poco más el sombrero del Teatro del Puente porque el siguiente invitado es el director de un espacio independiente, el Nightingale Theatre, que a mí personalmente, por mi relación con el teatro independiente, me resulta muy interesante conocer esa experiencia, sobre todo porque ellos han venido trabajando también con un plan muy potente de vinculación con el entorno y con vinculación con los artistas, promoviendo las escrituras, el trabajo en la performance y en la danza. Entonces, para la gente que tenemos espacios, que estamos a cargo de espacios pequeños, tanto dedicados al teatro o a la danza, esta experiencia puede ser muy interesante, muy atractiva para poder también conocer experiencias de otros lugares. Entonces quiero dejar con ustedes al director del Nightingale Theatre, Stephen Brett. Gracias.
I'm very grateful to be here and speak amongst such luminaries. And today it looks like we go from those fantastic big networks and overviews of audience development and running venues to the micro. And when I talk about the micro, I mean the very, very small. The Nightingale Theatre is what we refer to in Great Britain as a pub theatre. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that, essentially, the pub theatre is a found space. Pubs or drinking places in the UK were traditionally over several floors and were often coach houses. And that was certainly the case of the Grand Central, which is the building you see here, which is right beside Brighton train station in the UK. Brighton is where we are from. And you can see here, this was an old coach house. And traditionally, the ground floor was always the pub. It was divided into family bits and men drinking bits. The middle floor was the dining room and kitchen areas. And the top floor, just below the dome there, was the hotel. Now, as that became financially unviable through time, the pubs became the places. The pub managers would live in the accommodation upstairs, and the middle floors became a bit defunct. And so over time, and we're talking quite some time ago, as found spaces, they became theatres. There are a lot of them in London, but they are spread out throughout the UK, and there are also quite a lot in Brighton. We're one of maybe 6 or 7 different pub theatres in Brighton. What we do as the Nightingale is, I should just emphasize that bit between London and Brighton. London has a population of 11.5 million people, and so can draw on those as their audience. Brighton has a population of 225,000, and so with quite a few theatres that I'll talk about later. So the tension that we have in terms of trying to keep and draw our audiences is completely different to that experience of London. So London has wonderful pub theatres that have kind of world-renowned, the Bush, the Gate. For theatre, there's a small children's theatre one. And they are able to draw on a much greater audience pool than we would in Brighton. And I think that's an important distinction to make as I talk further about our experience in presenting. What we do at the Nightingale is we do artist support and development and small-scale performance. And I'll talk about the scale in a second. But what's important about those two is the tension that we find between those. The tension between us supporting artists to create work that might sometimes be quite difficult, and then presenting that performance, and how do we engage our audience and bring our audience into it, to experience those creative processes. So sometimes there's a tension between those two, and that's our main focus within Brighton. We run our program of artist development on what we call a scaffold of support. So this picture is actually not of them building the Nightingale, that's just a picture of scaffold that I brought with me. We call it a scaffold of support to indicate the different pathways that artists might choose and the different kinds of support that they may ask of us. We used to call it a ladder of development, a ladder of support that would start off with an idea and then would go to, say, for example, a scratch performance, then into a kind of a rehearsed reading of a small version before going into a full performance, and that was kind of a ladder. But we really quickly realized that not everybody works in that way, so we've offered a scaffold of support. In terms of, and that can be applied to artists at all stages of development, from emerging and new artists right through to very experienced professionals working on the small scale. What we've done with that is most of our funding comes from the Arts Council of England, and our application to them was based on a series of offers. Now, what we have to do within Brighton is make our offer distinct, and so we've offered artists different packages according to what they need and where they are in their development as artists. And that's a very important distinction to make, so that we support very experienced artists, and one of the fundamental changes that we've made in that is to say that art and theatre and creativity is their job, and so we will give them some money to make work in our theatre. That's a very small amount of money, but it's kind of like a weekly wage that says, we'll give you some money because we recognize that what you do is create work. That's your job. Those who are starting off, they get support in terms of us, and I think that that's one of the important parts to emphasize in terms of the scaffold of experience is the experience of the Nightingale team. I run it with my colleague Kate Gower, and we both come from an artist background. Strangely, we were both dancers, and we've ended up in a theatre, but essentially, we come with all of that experience of working and creating and interpreting and performing. And all of that experience with then moving across into management and producing and administration gives us kind of a wealth of experience that we can feed into the artists who are working in the space. And I say the space, and the space is very important for the Nightingale. The space is what allows the people to work in. And we believe that the artists know what they want to do. And our job is simply to facilitate that. So we pass a lot of the responsibility onto the artists in terms of being in the space. That's not something that we predetermine for them. And I'll talk about that a little bit now. This is essentially the Nightingale space. What you can't see there, because it looks like a lovely kind of slightly asymmetrical black box theatre, is that in actual fact it's just 12 meters by 6 meters at its widest point. So when I said we were going micro, I mean we're going very, very small. We have a seating capacity of 48. So in terms of revenue production, we're not great on that level. This is the space that I walked into 4 years ago. So you'll also excuse me that, through this whole presentation is that I feel like I'm the baby in the room. I've been running a theatre for 4 years only. So I am really still learning. And when I was invited to speak here, I thought, and one of the briefs was to maybe give some solutions to problems that you've encountered. I'm afraid that's really not going to happen. I've got more questions than solutions, but they're good questions, so we'll carry on with that. What I enjoyed when I went into this space is that it was black and it was full of possibilities. The seating is not set. Our seating is completely collapsible, and we can set the space up in any formation we like, and that's about the responsibility then that we pass on to the performers. How would you like your relationship to be with the performers? And what that does is that at the very first instance, it changes the nature of the conversation that you have with artists. And therefore, you change the nature of that artist's relationship to the audience. And that felt very significant for us in terms of how we drew an audience in, because we understood that there wouldn't be a single experience that they would have. They would have a series of different kinds of experiences depending on how the stage was set up and depending on how the artists decided they would like to engage with the audience. Also, it's very intense. In a 12 by 6 meter performing area, particularly when you're presenting dance, not only can you see and hear the performers, you can actually feel the heat as they get warmer, you can see the sweat, and you can see the struggle that sometimes happens. And that's a very different audience experience, which personally I love to bits. It's my passion. This is what it looks like in one formation. So this is the not quite the full 48 seats set out, but it gives you an idea of what the space is like. Now, this was the old Victorian dining room. Unfortunately, you can't see at the back there. There's still the fireplace. There's still a hole in the wall that we put a bit of wood over. That was the old dumbwaiter. I don't know if you have that transfers the food from the kitchen down into the pub and up into the theatre. So that all of those mechanisms still exist in the theatre. The question I asked myself when I got into this is that if I want to make this space as available and as adaptable as possible, then surely I must make the rest of the spaces available. Off to the side of this room here is what you called the old smoking room in the old days, where the gentlemen used to retire and have a cigarette or a cigar after their meal. There's a small room off. There's also the kitchen area. And once you start moving into the other areas on this floor, then we move up into the flat. And then we come with our moniker that says that theatre can happen anywhere. And then we started to try and properly enforce that. We tried to make every space in our theatre available. And so one of the strategies that we did to try and help our audience come to terms with that idea was that we named everything back to what their original functions were. So when people came to the Nightingale, they would come to a performance in the dining room, or they would go to a performance in the smoking room, or they would go to a performance in the hotel, as it once was, upstairs. Now, what that allowed us to do was also then to place works in their intended environment. So rather than the theatre becoming a place that you would create an imaginary room, a living room, a bedsit, a kitchen, a toilet, whatever, we could transfer that into those real settings. And that became part of the whole function of the theatre. We can't do that by ourselves, and we get the support of the pub. Now, one of the crucial elements of the Nightingale is the relationship we have to Drink in Brighton. Now, Drink in Brighton are a big organisation. They run 40 pubs across all of Brighton, and now they're extending their ownership of pubs into London. They owned the leasehold of this whole building. And the people who ran the theatre before me negotiated with the pub that if they renovated that space back to being a theatre, that they would be allowed to use it for free. So we did not pay to use the space that we have. The buy-off with the pub business was that all of our audience come through the pub, they buy a drink on the way, and they enjoy their drink while they're watching the show. They come back down afterwards, they have a drink after the show, and then the pub makes some money off us without actually having to do anything. We present that as a model of an arts and business relationship. If I'm perfectly honest, I'm not sure how much the pub know about that relationship. They kind of let us do what we want to do. Now, that's a very beneficial relationship for us. We don't pay for the space, so we don't pass that cost on to artists. So whereas artists normally are trying to hire spaces to create work, what we can do is to invite artists in, to imagine what their work would be like and what their relationship to the audience is, and also for them to understand that they don't have to pay for that. Not only do they not pay for the space, they don't pay for the expertise that we provide that. So we provide dramaturgical support, we provide mentoring support, we provide support in reading applications to arts, to funding bodies. All of those are kind of things that we can afford to do because we don't pay for the space. The biggest thing that that relationship does is that it affords us the luxury and privilege of freedom. And that freedom has been vital in shaping our thinking in going forward. That freedom's allowed us to do performances in anywhere, to support artists at all stages of their careers, to do, and now I get to that little bit that everybody kind of needs to know, which makes us sound impressive, I hope, in front of all of these wonderful people, is that what it allowed us to do was to run a space part-time. We run the space part-time, but as part-time runners of a space, if you can call it that, programmers, etc., producers, I think in the 4 years that we've been running the space has been unoccupied, i.e. not used by artists to create or perform for 8 days over the 40 years. In those 4 years, I estimate that we have been partly responsible for the creation of between 180 to 200 pieces of work. And those pieces of work have gone to Edinburgh, overseas, nationally. They've won awards. And the emphasis on always on that is the small scale. And what that freedom has afforded us is a voice in a bigger sphere for the small scale. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. The thing about the freedom, too, is that it involves artists and the audience. And constantly looking, as I say, about that relationship. That's the first conversation that we have with artists, and that's how we look at that space. I'll just quickly run through, because I've got a fairly short presentation, about the kind of people that we support. So we support emerging artists. Martin Bonger up there on the left was an artist who came to us as a performer in a piece and has now gone on to start making his own work. David Shepherd here on the right was one of the great things about having the flat, the hotel that we had upstairs, was that we could house 2 artists for free. So they get the benefit of, being poor starving artists, but with a roof over their heads at least. And they would, in return for that, they would help us run the space. So David started off with us as one of those artists, and he's now made 3 separate works that have appeared in the space. We also work with very, very established artists. These 2 lovely middle-aged men, Jonathan Burrows and Matteo Farjan, doing 2 of their pieces here, and that's their advertising material for one of those. And other performers such as Wendy Houston and Philippe Blanchard. These are very experienced artists who specifically make work for the small scale. It's enabled us to explore those unusual and contexts in which artists to perform. So Adrian Howells over there has created a work about his early life as a cross-dresser called An Audience with Adrienne, which in theatre spaces, they decorate the theatre as somebody's living room. We had a living room, so Adrienne went up and occupied our living room for the performances. Down here is this lovely little picture of a house here, is by a company called Tinned Fingers, 2 lovely ladies from Bristol, and their piece called Wild Thing I Love You, they performed in a tent. So we erected a tent inside the theatre and they could perform there. And then finally, as I said, the sad kind of postscript to this is that we've just had to leave the Nightingale space and we're looking for another space. But somebody asked me if I could say what was the proudest thing that I would say about the Nightingale, I would say is that we have done performances in every single space across the 3 floors, including the toilet. So this is David Waring doing what he called a private dance in the toilet. It allows us to do diverse forms. And the diverse forms of theatre that we've been doing allows us to engage with different kinds of audiences and hopefully entice them into other shows. I have to say, if I'm being brutally honest about it all, we don't have very much evidence to say that people are coming across those diverse forms. There are a lot of theatres in Brighton and people are making choices. So the choices that they're making are very much predicated largely on their taste or on something else that I'll come back to a bit later. But this has allowed us to do things that cross forms. So you can see up in the top corner there, Caroline doing her performance of Mess about anorexia, to the lovely Annie Brooks doing her puppet work here. And it also allows us to do new writing and dance. So the two pieces that cross gender, race, and all other aspects. Colin and Simon doing a duet there about masculinity, and Alex and Jamila doing their piece about being young and black in London. It's also allowed us to change form. Here, the Unbuilt Room that we talk about here is a piece that a performance artist called Seth Kriebel developed that's sort of an analog game, a real person computer game where he becomes the computer and people have to navigate their way through, in this case, the Nightingale space. Across all of those things, what we've found is most important is our engagement, our personal engagement with the audience. And we try always, the advantage about being in a pub is that we can have a drink as well before a show and talk to our audience. It allows us to talk to our audience before and after, because we have our instant social setting where people can stay. Now, I have to say that that's fraught with difficulties. In the 4 years that I was running the Nightingale, I think we had 10 different bar managers downstairs, all with their own perspective about how best to run what's essentially a station, a train station drinking establishment, so largely a transient drinking audience. Some of them decided that it was best idea to as a club and have loud music going on, which of course just means our audience run away as fast as they can. But in conversations with them about sort of more ambient music, then we found that our audience will stay and will talk about the shows, which, as Alan was saying, is kind of one of those primary indicators of people coming back. We've also done a range of activities away from straight performance to allow us to try and engage with audiences in different ways. Down in the bottom left-hand corner is Firecracker, which is a youth group, a youth theatre group that we run on Monday nights in the Nightingale. Bulbul 2013 was a playwriting competition we did that was based around topics emerging from the Arab Spring. That lovely little moniker up in the top corner, that's the tree with lots of birds going to. We try to use lots of bird analogies because we're the Nightingale. But this was our Nightingale Social, and the Nightingale Social was a place for professionals across the theatre spectrum to come and meet informally and maybe make connections to engage with each other or meet new and different people. Up in the top left-hand corner, an artist development program we ran called, a residency program we ran called Rules and Regs, which is about challenging artists' creative process. And then finally, to get back to our moniker of theatre can happen anywhere, we were kind of forced to think that actually if we were saying theatre can happen anywhere, then it can't simply be building-based. It needs to move off. So we've moved off-site as well as being within the building. And one of our first projects was as part of an event called White Night in Brighton. And White Night was where we did arts activities throughout the night in Brighton. It comes from French Nuit Blanche, and we just sort of stole their idea, really, and ran a program all night. But one of the things that we did was this fantastic thing called We Are Not Heroes by a Welsh artist called Sean Twan John, and that involved them dressing up as superheroes and driving around on mobility scooters through Brighton. And the idea with that, because one of the early indicators that I got about running this little pub theatre in Brighton was in my informal market research. I came across the perspective that, oh, that's really great, but you're up the hill. Now, I live in Brighton and I can get to most places in less than 20 minutes walking. So that we were 4 minutes up the hill, and that being an obstacle for people to come to the Nightingale was something that I struggled with philosophically as well as in reality. So we had Sean bring his audience on the mobility scooters up to the Nightingale. If you can't take Muhammad to the mountain. Anyway, our offsite then developed into what's been our largest project to date. It's called Dip Your Toe. And this was a project that we did as part of the cultural program for the Olympiad. We were asked to respond to a particular project that was running in the southeast of England. And David, who I showed you before, had this idea that he always wanted to do performance in these things that are called Victorian bathing machines. Now you can see a picture up on the top right-hand corner. They were prevalent over all of the beaches in the UK. Different styles of them. Those are the particular ones for Brighton. But then during the Second World War, the First World War, excuse me, during the First World War, they were worried that an invading German army would use it as fuel, so they burnt all of them, and there was only a handful left. So we did a project where we recreated 6 Victorian bathing machines and dotted them around Brighton at varying points, and we put an open call out for commissions and put 6 different performances in each of these bathing machines. So the one on the left there is our kind of prototype model of it, and it had various programs in it, from kaleidoscopic film to 2 ladies doing the Department of Unreliable memoirs, where an audience would go in and they'd assume that person to be very famous, and they'd talk about them and around them in very famous ways. The one on the right here is one of my favorites. This was the turret that you can see sticking out the top is a camera obscura. I don't know if you've heard if you know a camera obscura. So essentially it was dark inside, and that projected an image of that all around, and the performance happened both inside and outside, and it rotates around. We also had, I tried to include a gorgeous image of a performance artist called Boogaloo Stew, who has a big quiff and platforms, and he did a piece where he created sock puppets of people's ideal lovers, which is quite interesting. These are all of these things that I'm mentioning show you the diversity of programming that we do to try and maintain the channels open for people to come to the Nightingale, that allows them to visit and exchange and experience. This was a fantastic experience for us and allowed our profile to build within the city. Still, I find that when I talk to people in the city, they say to me, "Oh, you run the Nightingale. I've always meant to go there, but I've just never been." And as informal market research, that's quite shocking. It's also slightly backed up by the idea that I have 2 young children. And as a single parent, I take my children to school often, and I have conversations with the other parents in the schoolyard, all who know that I run the Nightingale Theatre. And I can say probably the best strategy I have for attracting audiences to the Nightingale is to tell parents in the schoolyard to come to a particular show. This is a really brilliant show, you'd love it. And I can see that difference actually in the theatre. And I see those people come in. And I think getting back to the idea of some of the things that Alan was talking about was that one of the biggest strategies that we try and work towards is about that personal communication. That in a city the size of Brighton, the personal makes a very big difference to the way our audience engage. So strategies that we've developed are that we'll randomly choose an audience member and buy them a drink after the show and have a conversation with them. Now, you know, there are times when they enjoy the drink more than the conversation, but still, it's about that ability for, or that opening the doors for people to have that conversation if they want to. My previous incarnation was as a dancer, and as I moved from being a dancer to talking to dance audiences, one of the biggest issues that I dealt with often was audience members going into a contemporary dance performance saying to me, "But what if I don't understand what I see?" To which, of course, the response is, there may not be anything to understand. What if I don't agree with my wife who sat next to me? Again, as Alan says, you know, everybody has a unique experience. So those are things that we're trying to sort of deal with in that way. We kind of talk about it as making ourselves available. We try and make ourselves available as much as possible to artists and to audience. So who is this team that run this little place that can do all of these things? Well, I'll start off by saying that we're part-time. Officially, I run the Nightingale on 2.5 days a week, as does Kate. And these monikers that I've given us give you a vague sense of a structure that doesn't really exist, actually. We work really, really well when there's the 4 of us in one room and we can talk about what our strategy will be. So this is how it sits. There's me as the first person who interviewed for the job. I walked in the door, I realized I couldn't do it alone, and I asked Kate to join me. Janine was the other one of the artists who lived upstairs, and she stayed on after we the access to the hotel part of the theatre was taken away from us. And she stayed on and she does theatre administration and develops her own work. And then we have Neon, who's now running the press and marketing. And that's important for us because we, as a very, very small organization with very limited financial resources, we like to run ourselves as a less paper organization. So it's quite interesting to hear about programs and the likes. We try to, as much as possible, guide our audiences through the internet and web and online services in that way. There is once a year that we do our festival program. We're part of the Brighton Fringe. And Brighton Fringe, during that time, we do 130 performances in 4 weeks. And we produce a brochure for that. And that allows us to raise our profile within the city. But otherwise, all of our activity, all of the things that we're doing are driving people through our website. So we have our Facebook page and we have our Twitter account. Again, we're learning how to use those things because it seems like there are different ways. One of the biggest learning curves that we've had around things like Twitter. So for example, even during the Fringe, we can tweet out that if a show's not selling well, that we've got half-price tickets available. We have no evidence to show that that makes a massive difference to the number of people who turn up. However, we are also learning that people don't just want to know about shows, they want to know about, as you were saying, Alan, also, which is interesting around what is the philosophy, why are we doing these things, what is it that we do and why. Of course, I like to think of ourselves as the most important venue in Brighton, but we're not. At 48 seats, that's not quite real. So there are other fantastic venues, of which really only one is a purpose-built theatre. And that's the Theatre Royal down here, and that's the oldest theatre, or one of I think only 2 theatres left in Great Britain that still use the old ropes to bring in the light. So it's a proper old-fashioned theatre with a very tiny stage and a very conservative audience that come to see Alan Ayckbourn plays and sing along to Grease on a Friday night. The one in the top right-hand corner is the biggest venue that we have in Brighton. It's called the Brighton, well actually it's not, but it's the biggest public sector funded theatre in Brighton. It's the Brighton Dome, who also run the Brighton International Festival. And they see themselves as the big daddy that sits over the top of all of Brighton. Some of us have a slightly different view, but that's the way that they see themselves. And they're very, very good at programming across all of the spectrums from music and literature and performance. There is one bigger venue in Brighton, which is extraordinarily famous, and you'll all recognize it when I tell you. It's called, it's actually just called the Brighton Centre. It has about 3,000 seats in it. And it was where ABBA won the Eurovision Song Contest. So Brighton has a claim to fame in launching ABBA. The other 2 venues here, the one up above is called the Basement. It's been a modified venue that was built, as the name indicates, from a basement. And the one down at the bottom here is the Marlborough, which is another one of the pub theatres. And now that's run by David, who I spoke to you before, lives upstairs, came downstairs, learned how to run a theatre with us, and is now running a pub theatre in Brighton, very much with an LGBT focus. Now, as I said earlier on, what running the Nightingale has done is has afforded us a voice for the small scale in larger fora. Now this is a slightly out of focus picture, sorry about that. That's just simply to indicate one of the primary things that I've discovered in my conversations of late. That is that as public sector funding, what we're looking at increasingly is being able to make the rationale to our policy setters in government for making the case for culture. That becomes a very difficult and problematic conversation to have. In terms of lobbying, the starting point tends to be to justify the existence of culture. For me personally is a very, very difficult starting point, but that's where people are starting from. So they start to make the very common arguments to policymakers, i.e., in Britain, £1 of investment in culture usually means between £5 and £6 in return. The cultural sector is growing in this sort of post-recession era at a rate about 2 or 3 times any other of the sectors that the government look at, industry, banking, etc., etc. Those feel that the issue that I have, and the reason that I brought up this, and the reason I'm speaking from a small-scale perspective is that what that does is that it sets a series of criteria around assessing and the ability of those organizations to deliver against those criteria. So the big organizations are very capable of saying, we have this many thousands of people come through the door and we've affected this many people and our impact is huge and we're reaching out, and now we're not just doing London, we're doing down in Kent, and we're reaching out and we're reaching hundreds of people. And they're doing that in the top end, and they have their kind of, the Sadler's Wells, the Royal Ballets, the National Theatres are able to present programs that can do all of that. What it starts to do is to affect these people down here, and the small scale and the radical. And that's where I work primarily, is around that small scale and radical work. We can't make those figures add up in the same way. It feels to me like what happens is that we become absorbed with numbers. And that absorption with numbers means that that very significant work made on the small scale that really only attracts a very small number of people, it loses its significance. It loses its ability to be part of that ecological arc. I use the analogy that says, if you were to say to somebody in the street, if I took away the bees from a natural ecology, they'd understand immediately that that would put that whole ecology into imbalance. My fear at the moment is that the criteria that we're applying to assess arts organizations means that these people down this end, the small scale and the radical doesn't necessarily mean small scale, that can be large scale, are starting to suffer and make it more and more difficult to make the case for existence. And I feel that's putting that whole ecology, the cultural ecology, is starting to be put into imbalance. So part of what the rationale that I would like to say, and part of the tension that I mentioned at the very, very beginning, is about the artists. The impact, we talk about audience engagement and impact in terms of those audience and those participants. I feel like sometimes we lose the conversation around the impact on artists, and that those artists' contribution to the greater scale. Declan Donnellan said to me once when we were in Argentina, that Buenos Aires has, I think in his terms, the third largest permanent musical scene in the world, behind Broadway and London. But what that does is it allows radical writers to react to that and create a whole environment. And we need all parts of the spectrum. I'm not trying to say don't give to here. I'm saying don't ignore here. The final thing I'd like to talk about is, did I just push end? Did I just push end? I did. I had one more slide. It's gone. The slide was to do about how do we communicate to a younger audience. I'm trying not to be too obsessed by the idea that we have these small little gadgets that we carry around with us. It's all right, don't worry. I'll just talk. These small gadgets that we carry around with us, which allow us instant access. And how do we use that positively when the generation who are learning to use it can make such instant decisions? They can access information instantly. My 7-year-old daughter said to me, when I told her that there was a new theory that maybe dinosaurs had little feathers on them, she said, no, that's not possible, ask Google. So their concept about how to access information is changing. And we have these mobile phones that allow them to access a huge amount of information and make instant choices about what they're going to do. So one of the things that I've been mulling with, and I don't have a question, but I'd like to, if anybody does have an answer to it, I'd really, really, really like to hear about it. And by the way, possibly you'd make a lot of money telling everybody, is that what we've done currently, I think to date, is to look at how we can invite those people who might not normally come to have that live experience, how we can encourage them to come and have the live experience, that very unique live experience, as opposed to engaging and having an experience that they can make a decision about instantly. And my idea is that we've gone to them and said, come, we're really lovely, we love you here, please come and sit in our theatre and we'll entertain you for an hour and then you can bugger off and do whatever you want. But instead of that, I think that there's possibly a way that we can communicate to them so that we can talk a language that allows them to communicate back to us. I think that's the question and the idea that I'm playing with most at the moment as we move forwards. Anyway, that's an experience of the small scale. It's, as I said, it's an experience that I'm still very, very, very much still learning on my feet about. The Nightingale itself faces new challenges in that we no longer have a home in that building that I showed you previously. So we're also, apart from discovering new ways of working with our audiences, we're also discovering new ways of working with artists. The interesting thing about not having a home was when I said to you at the very beginning about how the space, inviting an artist into the space and saying to them, how would you like to engage to an audience? Now that we no longer have a home, our conversation with artists in terms of their creation process says, what do you really need to make your work? What do you really need at that first instance, maybe, to make your work? Do you actually need a space where you can just walk and talk? Do you need a table that you can sit around comfortably that's not your kitchen table where you can work? Is there some... And so the conversation with artists is already changing, and that's a really positive thing. I will just say, just to finish off, to carry on that idea that theatre can happen anywhere, for the next version of the Brighton Fringe Festival, which will be next month, we've commissioned a local playwright to write a piece that will be between 3 and 5 minutes long, that will be performed by a person to another person anywhere. And at the end of that 5-minute performance, the person who was the audience receives the script and becomes the performer, and somebody else comes in and they will perform to them and pass the script on. So that the idea that audience, and part of the rationale behind that is to break down again once more that barrier between the perceptions of who is the audience and who is the performer. Thank you very much.